Yes, of course it does, but I don't go home much. There's no life there, little to feed a man's higher nature. Boston's very narrow, you know, she doesn't know it, and you couldn't convince her of it, so I say nothing when I'm there. Where's the use? Yes, Boston is very narrow, but she has such a good opinion of herself that she can't see it. A man who has traveled as much as I have, and seen as much of the world, sees it plain enough, but he can't cure it, you know, so the best is to leave it, and seek a sphere which is more in harmony with his tastes and culture. I run across there, once a year perhaps, when I have nothing important on hand, but I'm very soon back again. I spend my time in Europe. HIC, you map out your plans and… GS No, excuse me, I don't map out any plans. I simply follow the inclination of the day. I am limited by no ties, no requirements. I am not bound in any way. I am too old a traveler to hamper myself with deliberate purposes. I am simply a traveler, an inveterate traveler, a man of the world. In a word, I can call myself by no other name. I do not say, I am going here or I am going there. I say nothing at all, I only act. For instance, next week you may find me the guest of a grandee of Spain, or you may find me off for Venice, or flitting toward Dresden. I shall probably go to Egypt presently. Friends will say to friends, he is at the Nile cataracts, and at that very moment they will be surprised to learn that I'm away off yonder in India somewhere. I'm a constant surprise to people. They are always saying, yes, he was in Jerusalem when we heard of him last, but goodness knows where he is now. Presently the grandson rose to leave, discovered he had an appointment with some emperor, perhaps. He did his graces over again, gripped me with one talon, at arm's length, pressed his hat against his stomach with the other, bent his body in the middle 3 times, murmuring, "Pleasure, am sure, great pleasure, am sure, wish you much success." Then he removed his gracious presence. It is a great and solemn thing to have a grandfather. I have not purposed to misrepresent this boy in any way, for what little indignation he excited in me soon passed and left nothing behind it but compassion. One cannot keep up a grudge against a vacuum. I have tried to repeat this lad's very words. If I have failed anywhere, I have at least not failed to reproduce the marrow and meaning of what he said. He and the innocent chatterbox whom I met on the Swiss lake are the most unique and interesting specimens of young America I came across during my foreign tramping. I have made honest portraits of them, not caricatures. The grandson of 23 referred to himself 5 or 6 times as an old traveler, and as many as 3 times with a serene complacency which was maddening as a man of the world. There was something very delicious about his leaving Boston to her narrowness, unreproved and uninstructed. I formed the caravan in marching order presently, and after riding down the line to see that it was properly roped together, gave the command to proceed. In a little while, the road carried us to open, grassy land. We were above the troublesome forest now, and had an uninterrupted view, straight before us, of our summit, the summit of the Riffelberg. We followed the mule road, a zigzag course, now to the right, now to the left, but always up, and always crowded and incommoded by going and coming files of reckless tourists who were never, in a single instance, tied together. I was obliged to exert the utmost care and caution, for in many places the road was not 2 yards wide, and often the lower side of it sloped away in slanting precipices 8 and even 9 feet deep. I had to encourage the men constantly to keep them from giving way to their unmanly fears. We might have made the summit before night, but for a delay caused by the loss of an umbrella. I was allowing the umbrella to remain lost, but the men murmured, and with reason, for in this exposed region we stood in peculiar need of protection against avalanches, so I went into camp and detached a strong party to go after the missing article. The difficulties of the next morning were severe, but our courage was high, for our goal was near. At noon we conquered the last impediment. We stood at last upon the summit, and without the loss of a single man except the mule that ate the glycerin. Our great achievement was achieved. The possibility of the impossible was demonstrated, and Harris and I walked proudly into the great dining room of the Riffelberg Hotel and stood our alpenstocks up in the corner. Yes, I had made the grand ascent, but it was a mistake to do it in evening dress. The plug hats were battered, the swallowtails were fluttering rags, mud added no grace, the general effect was unpleasant and even disreputable. There were about 75 tourists at the hotel, mainly ladies and little children, and they gave us an admiring welcome, which paid us for all our privations and sufferings. The ascent had been made, and the names and dates now stand recorded on a stone monument there to prove it to all future tourists. I boiled a thermometer and took an altitude with a most curious result. The summit was not as high as the point on the mountainside where I had taken the first altitude. Suspecting that I had made an important discovery, I prepared to verify it. There happened to be a still higher summit, called the Gorner Grat, above the hotel, and notwithstanding the fact that it overlooks a glacier from a dizzy height, and that the ascent is difficult and dangerous, I resolved to venture up there and boil a thermometer. So I sent a strong party, with some borrowed hose, in charge of 2 chiefs of service, to dig a stairway in the soil all the way up, and this I ascended, roped to the guides. This breezy height was the summit proper, so I accomplished even more than I had originally purposed to do. This foolhardy exploit is recorded on another stone monument. I boiled my thermometer, and sure enough, this spot, which purported to be 2,000 feet higher than the locality of the hotel, turned out to be 9,000 feet lower. Thus the fact was clearly demonstrated that above a certain point, the higher a point seems to be, the lower it actually is. Our ascent itself was a great achievement, but this contribution to science was an inconceivably greater matter. Cavillers object that water boils at a lower and lower temperature the higher and higher you go, and hence the apparent anomaly. I answer that I do not base my theory upon what the boiling water does, but upon what a boiled thermometer says. You can't go behind the thermometer. I had a magnificent view of Monte Rosa and apparently all the rest of the Alpine world from that high place. All the circling horizon was piled high with a mighty tumult of snowy crests. One might have imagined he saw before him the tented camps of a beleaguering host of Brobdingnagians. Note, I had the very unusual luck to catch one little momentary glimpse of the Matterhorn wholly unencumbered by clouds. I leveled my photographic apparatus at it without the loss of an instant, and should have got an elegant picture if my donkey had not interfered. It was my purpose to draw this photograph all by myself for my book, but was obliged to put the mountain part of it into the hands of the professional artist, because I found I could not do landscape well. But lonely, conspicuous, and superb rose that wonderful upright wedge, the Matterhorn. Its precipitous sides were powdered over with snow, and the upper half hidden in thick clouds which now and then dissolved to cobweb films and gave brief glimpses of the imposing tower as through a veil. A little later the Matterhorn took to himself the semblance of a volcano. He was stripped naked to his apex. Around this circled vast wreaths of white cloud which strung slowly out and streamed away slantwise toward the sun, a 20-mile stretch of rolling and tumbling vapor and looking just as if it were pouring out of a crater. Later again, one of the mountain's sides was clean and clear, and another side densely clothed from base to summit in thick smoke-like cloud, which feathered off and flew around the shaft's sharp edge like the smoke around the corners of a burning building. The Matterhorn is always experimenting and always gets up fine effects too. In the sunset, when all the lower world is palled in gloom, it points toward heaven out of the pervading blackness like a finger of fire. In the sunrise, well, they say it is very fine in the sunrise. Authorities agree that there is no such tremendous layout of snowy alpine magnitude, grandeur, and sublimity to be seen from any other accessible point as the tourist may see from the summit of the Riffelberg. Therefore, let the tourist rope himself up and go there, for I have shown that with nerve, caution, and judgment, the thing can be done. I wish to add one remark here, in parentheses, so to speak, suggested by the word snowy, which I have just used. We have all seen hills and mountains and levels with snow on them, and so we think we know all the aspects and effects produced by snow, but indeed we do not until we have seen the Alps. Possibly mass and distance add something, at any rate something is added. Among other noticeable things, there is a dazzling, intense whiteness about the distant alpine snow when the sun is on it, which one recognizes as peculiar and not familiar to the eye. The snow which one is accustomed to has a tint to it. Painters usually give it a bluish cast, but there is no perceptible tint to the distant alpine snow when it is trying to look its whitest. As to the unimaginable splendor of it when the sun is blazing down on it, well, it simply is unimaginable. Chapter 39. We travel by glacier. A guidebook is a queer thing. The reader has just seen what a man who undertakes the great ascent from Zermatt to the Riffelberg Hotel must experience. Yet Baedeker makes these strange statements concerning this matter. I have pretty effectually throttled these errors by sending him the following demonstrated facts. I found my arnica invaluable. My men were suffering excruciatingly from the friction of sitting down so much. During 2 or 3 days, not one of them was able to do more than lie down or walk about, yet so effective was the arnica that on the 4th all were able to sit up. I consider that, more than to anything else, I owe the success of our great undertaking to arnica and paregoric. My men are being restored to health and strength. My main perplexity now was how to get them down the mountain again. I was not willing to expose the brave fellows to the perils, fatigues, and hardships of that fearful route again, if it could be helped. First I thought of balloons, but of course I had to give that idea up, for balloons were not procurable. I thought of several other expedients, but upon consideration discarded them for cause. But at last I hit it. I was aware that the movement of glaciers is an established fact, for I had read it in Baedeker, so I resolved to take passage for Zermatt on the great Gorner Glacier. Very good. The next thing was how to get down the glacier comfortably, for the mule road to it was long and winding and wearisome. I set my mind at work and soon thought out a plan. One looks straight down upon the vast frozen river called the Gorner Glacier from the Gorner Grat, a sheer precipice 1,200 feet high. We had 154 umbrellas, and what is an umbrella but a parachute? I mentioned this noble idea to Harris with enthusiasm and was about to order the expedition to form on the Gorner Grat with their umbrellas and prepare for flight by platoons, each platoon in command of a guide, when Harris stopped me and urged me not to be too hasty. He asked me if this method of descending the Alps had ever been tried before. I said no, I had not heard of an instance. Then, in his opinion, it was a matter of considerable gravity. In his opinion, it would not be well to send the whole command over the cliff at once. A better way would be to send down a single individual first and see how he fared. I saw the wisdom in this idea instantly. I said as much and thanked my agent cordially and told him to take his umbrella and try the thing right away and wave his hat when he got down if he struck in a soft place, and then I would ship the rest right along. Harris was greatly touched with this mark of confidence and said so in a voice that had a perceptible tremble in it. But at the same time he said he did not feel himself worthy of so conspicuous a favor, that it might cause jealousy in the command, for there were plenty who would not hesitate to say he had used underhanded means to get the appointment, whereas his conscience would bear him witness that he had not sought it at all, nor even, in his secret heart, desired it. I said these words did him extreme credit, but that he must not throw away the imperishable distinction of being the first man to descend an Alp per parachute, simply to save the feelings of some envious underlings. No, I said, he must accept the appointment. It was no longer an invitation, it was a command. He thanked me with effusion and said that putting the thing in this form removed every objection. He retired and soon returned with his umbrella, his eye flaming with gratitude and his cheeks pallid with joy. Just then the head guide passed along. Harris's expression changed to one of infinite tenderness, and he said, "That man did me a cruel injury 4 days ago, and I said in my heart, he should live to perceive and confess that the only noble revenge a man can take upon his enemy is to return good for evil. I resign in his favor. Appoint him." I threw my arms around the generous fellow and said, "Harris, you are the noblest soul that lives. You shall not regret this sublime act, neither shall the world fail to know of it. You shall have opportunity far transcending this one too, if I live, remember that." I called the head guide to me and appointed him on the spot, but the thing aroused no enthusiasm in him. He did not take to the idea at all. He said, "Tie myself to an umbrella and jump over the Gorner Grat. Excuse me, there are a great many pleasanter roads to the devil than that." Upon a discussion of the subject with him, it appeared that he considered the project distinctly and decidedly dangerous. I was not convinced, yet I was not willing to try the experiment in any risky way, that is, in a way that might cripple the strength and efficiency of the expedition. I was about at my wits' end when it occurred to me to try it on the Latinist. He was called in, but he declined on the plea of inexperience, diffidence in public, lack of curiosity, and I didn't know what all. Another man declined on account of a cold in the head, thought he ought to avoid exposure. Another could not jump well, never could jump well, did not believe he could jump so far without long and patient practice. Another was afraid it was going to rain, and his umbrella had a hole in it. Everybody had an excuse. The result was what the reader has by this time guessed. The most magnificent idea that was ever conceived had to be abandoned, from sheer lack of a person with enterprise enough to carry it out. Yes, I actually had to give that thing up, while doubtless I should live to see somebody use it and take all the credit from me. Well, I had to go overland. There was no other way. I marched the expedition down the steep and tedious mule path and took up as good a position as I could upon the middle of the glacier, because Baedeker said the middle part travels the fastest. As a measure of economy, however, I put some of the heavier baggage on the shoreward parts to go as slow freight. I waited and waited, but the glacier did not move. Night was coming on, the darkness began to gather, still we did not budge. It occurred to me then that there might be a timetable in Baedeker. It would be well to find out the hours of starting. I called for the book. It could not be found. Bradshaw would certainly contain a timetable, but no Bradshaw could be found. Very well, I must make the best of the situation. So I pitched the tents, picketed the animals, milked the cows, had supper, pergoricked the men, established the watch, and went to bed, with orders to call me as soon as we came in sight of Zermatt. I awoke about 10:30 next morning and looked around. We hadn't budged a peg. At first I could not understand it, then it occurred to me that the old thing must be aground. So I cut down some trees and rigged a spar on the starboard and another on the port side, and fooled away upward of 3 hours trying to spar her off. But it was no use. She was half a mile wide and 15 or 20 miles long, and there was no telling just whereabouts she was aground. The men began to show uneasiness too, and presently they came flying to me with ashy faces, saying she had sprung a leak. Nothing but my cool behavior at this critical time saved us from another panic. I ordered them to show me the place. They led me to a spot where a huge boulder lay in a deep pool of clear and brilliant water. It did look like a pretty bad leak, but I kept that to myself. I made a pump and set the men to work to pump out the glacier. We made a success of it. I perceived then that it was not a leak at all. This boulder had descended from a precipice and stopped on the ice in the middle of the glacier, and the sun had warmed it up every day, and consequently it had melted its way deeper and deeper into the ice, until at last it reposed, as we had found it, in a deep pool of the clearest and coldest water. Presently Baedeker was found again, and I hunted eagerly for the timetable. There was none. The book simply said the glacier was moving all the time. This was satisfactory, so I shut up the book and chose a good position to view the scenery as we passed along. I stood there some time enjoying the trip, but at last it occurred to me that we did not seem to be gaining any on the scenery. I said to myself, this confounded old thing's aground again, sure, and opened Baedeker to see if I could run across any remedy for these annoying interruptions. I soon found a sentence which threw a dazzling light upon the matter. It said, "The Gorner Glacier travels at an average rate of a little less than an inch a day." I have seldom felt so outraged. I have seldom had my confidence so wantonly betrayed. I made a small calculation. 1 inch a day, say 30 feet a year. Estimated distance to Zermatt, 3 1/18 miles. Time required to go by glacier, a little over 500 years. I said to myself, I can walk it quicker, and before I will patronize such a fraud as this, I will do it. When I revealed to Harris the fact that the passenger part of this glacier, the central part, the lightning express part, so to speak, was not due in Zermatt till the summer of 2378, and that the baggage, coming along the slow edge, would not arrive until some generations later, he burst out with, That is European management all over, an inch a day, think of that, 500 years to go a trifle over 3 miles, but I am not a bit surprised. It's a Catholic glacier, you can tell by the look of it, and the management. I said no, I believed nothing, but the extreme end of it was in a Catholic canton. Well then, it's a government glacier, said Harris. It's all the same. Over here the government runs everything, so everything's slow and ill-managed. But with us, everything's done by private enterprise, and then there ain't much lolling around, you can depend on it. I wish Tom Scott could get his hands on this torpid old slab once, you'd see it take a different gait from this. I said I was sure he would increase the speed, if there was trade enough to justify it. He'd make trade, said Harris. That's the difference between governments and individuals. Governments don't care, individuals do. Tom Scott would take all the trade. In 2 years Gorner stock would go to 200, and inside of 2 more you would see all the other glaciers under the hammer for taxes. After a reflective pause, Harris added, a little less than an inch a day, a little less than an inch, mind you. Well, I'm losing my reverence for glaciers. I was feeling much the same way myself. I have traveled by canal boat, ox wagon, raft, and by the Ephesus and Smyrna railway, but when it comes down to good solid honest slow motion, I bet my money on the glacier. As a means of passenger transportation, I consider the glacier a failure, but as a vehicle of slow freight, I think she fills the bill. In the matter of putting the fine shades on that line of business, I judge she could teach the Germans something. I ordered the men to break camp and prepare for the land journey to Zermatt. At this moment, a most interesting find was made. A dark object, bedded in the glacial ice, was cut out with the ice axes, and it proved to be a piece of the undressed skin of some animal, a hair trunk, perhaps, but a close inspection disabled the hair trunk theory, and further discussion and examination exploded it entirely. That is, in the opinion of all the scientists, except the one who had advanced it. This one clung to his theory with affectionate fidelity characteristic of originators of scientific theories, and afterward won many of the first scientists of the age to his view, by a very able pamphlet which he wrote, entitled, Evidences going to show that the hair trunk, in a wild state, belonged to the early glacial period, and roamed the wastes of chaos in the company with the cave bear, primeval man, and the other oolitics of the old Silurian family. Each of our scientists had a theory of his own, and put forward an animal of his own as a candidate for the skin. I sided with the geologist of the expedition in the belief that this patch of skin had once helped to cover a Siberian elephant in some old forgotten age, but we divided there, the geologist believing that this discovery proved that Siberia had formerly been located where Switzerland is now, whereas I held the opinion that it merely proved that the primeval Swiss was not the dull savage he is represented to have been, but was a being of high intellectual development who liked to go to the menagerie. We arrived that evening, after many hardships and adventures, in some fields close to the great ice arch, where the mad Visp boils and surges out from under the foot of the great Gorner Glacier, and here we camped, our perils over, and our magnificent undertaking successfully completed. We marched into Zermatt the next day, and were received with the most lavish honors and applause. A document, signed and sealed by the authorities, was given to me which established and endorsed the fact that I had made the ascent of the Riffelberg. This I wear around my neck, and it will be buried with me when I am no more. Chapter 40. Piteous Relics at Chamonix. I'm not so ignorant about glacial movement now as I was when I took passage on the Gorner Glacier. I have read up since. I am aware that these vast bodies of ice do not travel at the same rate of speed. While the Gorner Glacier makes less than an inch a day, the Unteraar Glacier makes as much as 8, and still other glaciers are said to go 12, 16, and even 20 inches a day. One writer says that the slowest glacier travels 25 feet a year, and the fastest 400. What is a glacier? It is easy to say it looks like a frozen river which occupies the bed of a winding gorge or gully between mountains, but that gives no notion of its vastness, for it is sometimes 600 feet thick, and we are not accustomed to rivers 600 feet deep. No, our rivers are 6 feet, 20 feet, and sometimes 50 feet deep. We are not quite able to grasp so large a fact as an ice river 600 feet deep. The glacier's surface is not smooth and level, but has deep swales and swelling elevations, and sometimes has the look of a tossing sea whose turbulent billows were frozen hard in the instant of their most violent motion. The glacier's surface is not a flawless mass, but is a river with cracks or crevices, some narrow, some gaping wide. Many a man, the victim of a slip or a misstep, has plunged down one of these and met his death. Men have been fished out of them alive, but it was when they did not go to great depth. The cold of the great depths would quickly stupefy a man, whether he was hurt or unhurt. These cracks do not go straight down. One can seldom see more than 20 to 40 feet down them. Consequently, men who have disappeared in them have been sought for in the hope that they had stopped within helping distance, whereas their case, in most instances, had really been hopeless from the beginning. In 1864, a party of tourists was descending Mont Blanc, and while picking their way over one of the mighty glaciers of that lofty region, roped together, as was proper, a young porter disengaged himself from the line and started across an ice bridge which spanned a crevice. It broke under him with a crash, and he disappeared. The others could not see how deep he had gone, so it might be worthwhile to try and rescue him. A brave young guide named Mitchell Payot volunteered. 2 ropes were made fast to his leather belt, and he bore the end of a third one in his hand to tie to the victim in case he found him. He was lowered into the crevice. He descended deeper and deeper between the clear blue walls of solid ice. He approached a bend in the crack and disappeared under it. Down and still down he went into this profound grave. When he had reached a depth of 80 feet, he passed under another bend in the crack, and thence descended 80 feet lower, as between perpendicular precipices. Arrived at this stage of 160 feet below the surface of the glacier, he peered through the twilight dimness and perceived that the chasm took another turn and stretched away at a steep slant to unknown deeps, for its course was lost in darkness. What a place that was to be in, especially if that leather belt should break. The compression of the belt threatened to suffocate the intrepid fellow. He called to his friends to draw him up, but could not make them hear. They still lowered him deeper and deeper. Then he jerked his third cord as vigorously as he could. His friends understood and dragged him out of those icy jaws of death. Then they attached a bottle to a cord and sent it down 200 feet, but it found no bottom. It came up covered with congelations, evidence enough that even if the poor porter reached the bottom with unbroken bones, a swift death from cold was sure anyway. A glacier is a stupendous, ever-progressing, resistless plow. It pushes ahead of it masses of boulders which are packed together, and they stretch across the gorge, right in front of it, like a long grave or a long, sharp roof. This is called a moraine. It also shoves out a moraine along each side of its course. Imposing as the modern glaciers are, they are not so huge as were some that once existed. For instance, Mr. Whymper says, at some very remote period, the valley of Aosta was occupied by a vast glacier, which flowed down its entire length from Mont Blanc to the plain of Piedmont, remained stationary, or nearly so, at its mouth for many centuries, and deposited there enormous masses of debris. The length of this glacier exceeded 80 miles, and it drained a basin 25 to 35 miles across, bounded by the highest mountains in the Alps. The great peaks rose several thousand feet above the glaciers, and then, as now, shattered by sun and frost, poured down their showers of rocks and stones, in witness of which there are the immense piles of angular fragments that constitute the moraines of Ivrea. The moraines around Ivrea are of extraordinary dimensions. That which was on the left bank of the glacier is about 13 miles long, and in some places rises to a height of 2,130 feet above the floor of the valley. The terminal moraines, those which are pushed in front of the glaciers, cover something like 20 square miles of country. At the mouth of the valley of Aosta, the thickness of the glacier must have been at least 2,000 feet, and its width, at that part, 5 miles and a quarter. It is not easy to get at a comprehension of a mass of ice like that. If one could cleave off the butt end of such a glacier, an oblong block 2 or 3 miles wide by 5 and a quarter long and 2,000 feet thick, he could completely hide the city of New York under it, and Trinity Steeple would only stick up into it relatively as far as a shingle nail would stick up into the bottom of a Saratoga trunk. The boulders from Mont Blanc, upon the plain below Ivrea, assure us that the glacier which transported them existed for a prodigious length of time. Their present distance from the cliffs, from which they were derived is about 420,000 feet, and if we assume that they traveled at the rate of 400 feet per annum, their journey must have occupied them no less than 1055 years. In all probability, they did not travel so fast. Glaciers are sometimes hurried out of their characteristic snail pace. A marvelous spectacle is presented then. Mr. Whymper refers to a case which occurred in Iceland in 1721. It seems that in the neighborhood of the mountain Kotlugja, large bodies of water formed underneath, or within the glaciers, either on account of the interior heat of the earth, or from other causes, and at length acquired irresistible power, tore the glaciers from their mooring on the land, and swept them over every obstacle into the sea. Prodigious masses of ice were thus borne for a distance of about 10 miles over land in the space of a few hours, and their bulk was so enormous that they covered the sea for 7 miles from the shore and remained aground in 600 feet of water. The denudation of the land was upon a grand scale. All superficial accumulations were swept away, and the bedrock was exposed. It was described, in graphic language, how all irregularities and depressions were obliterated, and a smooth surface of several miles' area laid bare, and that this area had the appearance of having been planed by a plane. The account translated from the Icelandic says that the mountain-like ruins of this majestic glacier so covered the sea that as far as the eye could reach no open water was discoverable, even from the highest peaks. A monster wall or barrier of ice was built across a considerable stretch of land, too, by this strange eruption. One can form some idea of the altitude of this barrier of ice when it is mentioned that from Hoftebrekke Farm, which lies high up on a fjeld, one could not see H. Jorleifshafti opposite, which is a fell 640 feet in height, but in order to do so had to clamber up a mountain slope east of Hoftebrekke, 1,200 feet high. These things will help the reader to understand why it is that a man who keeps company with glaciers comes to feel tolerably insignificant by and by. The Alps and the glaciers together are able to take every bit of conceit out of a man and reduce his self-importance to zero, if he will only remain within the influence of their sublime presence long enough to give it a fair and reasonable chance to do its work. The Alpine glaciers move, that is granted now by everybody, but there was a time when people scoffed at the idea. They said you might as well expect leagues of solid rock to crawl along the ground as expect leagues of ice to do it. But proof after proof was furnished, and finally the world had to believe. The wise men not only said the glacier moved, but they timed its movement. They ciphered out a glacier's gait and then said confidently that it would travel just so far in so many years. There is record of a striking and curious example of the accuracy which may be attained in these reckonings. In 1820, the ascent of Mont Blanc was attempted by a Russian and 2 Englishmen, with 7 guides. They had reached a prodigious altitude and were approaching the summit when an avalanche swept several of the party down a sharp slope of 200 feet and hurled 5 of them, all guides, into one of the crevices of a glacier. The life of one of the 5 was saved by a long barometer which was strapped to his back. It bridged the crevice and suspended him until help came. The alpenstock or baton of another saved its owner in a similar way. 3 men were lost, Pierre Baumet, Pierre Carrier, and Auguste Terraz. They had been hurled down into the fathomless great deeps of the crevice. Dr. Forbes, the English geologist, had made frequent visits to the Mont Blanc region and had given much attention to the disputed question of the movement of glaciers. During one of these visits, he completed his estimates of the rate of movement of the glacier, which had swallowed up the 3 guides, and uttered the prediction that the glacier would deliver up its dead at the foot of the mountain 35 years from the time of the accident, or possibly 40. A dull, slow journey, a movement imperceptible to any eye, but it was proceeding, nevertheless, and without cessation. It was a journey which a rolling stone would make in a few seconds. The lofty point of departure was visible from the village below in the valley. The prediction cut curiously close to the truth. 41 years after the catastrophe, the remains were cast forth at the foot of the glacier. I find an interesting account of the matter in the Histoire du Mont Blanc by Stephen Darve. I will condense this account as follows. On the 12th of August, 1861, at the hour of the close of Mass, a guide arrived out of breath at the Mary of Chamonix, and bearing on his shoulders a very lugubrious burden. It was a sack filled with human remains which he had gathered from the orifice of a crevice in the Glacier des Bossons. He conjectured that these were remains of the victims of the catastrophe of 1820, and a minute inquest, immediately instituted by the local authorities, soon demonstrated the correctness of his supposition. The contents of the sack were spread upon a long table and officially inventoried as follows. Portions of 3 human skulls, several tufts of black and blonde hair, a human jaw furnished with fine white teeth, a forearm and hand, all the fingers of the latter intact. The flesh was white and fresh, and both the arm and hand preserved a degree of flexibility in the articulations. The ring finger had suffered a slight abrasion, and the stain of the blood was still visible and unchanged after 41 years. A left foot, the flesh white and fresh. Along with these fragments were portions of waistcoats, hats, hobnailed shoes, and other clothing, a wing of a pigeon with black feathers, a fragment of an alpenstock, a tin lantern, and lastly, a boiled leg of mutton, the only flesh among all the remains that exhaled an unpleasant odor. The guide said that the mutton had no odor when he took it from the glacier. An hour's exposure to the sun had already begun the work of decomposition upon it. Persons were called for to identify these poor pathetic relics, and a touching scene ensued. 2 men were still living who had witnessed the grim catastrophe of nearly half a century before: Marie Cautet, saved by his baton, and Julien de Voisu, saved by the barometer. These aged men entered and approached the table. De Voisu, more than 80 years old, contemplated the mournful remains mutely and with a vacant eye, for his intelligence and his memory were torpid with age. But Cautet's faculties were still perfect at 72, and he exhibited strong emotion. He said, "Pierre Baumet was fair, he wore a straw hat. This bit of skull with the tuft of blonde hair was his, this is his hat. Pierre Carrier was very dark, this skull was his, and this felt hat. This is Baumet's hand, I remember it so well." And the old man bent down and kissed it reverently, then closed his fingers upon it in an affectionate grasp, crying out, "I could never have dared to believe that before quitting this world it would be granted me to press once more the hand of one of those brave comrades, the hand of my good friend Baumet." There is something weirdly pathetic about the picture of that white-haired veteran greeting with his loving handshake this friend who had been dead 40 years. When these hands had met last, they were alike in the softness and freshness of youth. Now one was brown and wrinkled and horny with age, while the other was still as young and fair and blemishless as if those 40 years had come and gone in a single moment, leaving no mark of their passage. Time had gone on in the one case, it had stood still in the other. A man who has not seen a friend for a generation keeps him in mind always as he saw him last, and is somehow surprised, and is also shocked, to see the aging change the years have wrought when he sees him again. Marie Cautet's experience in finding his friend's hand unaltered from the image of it which he had carried in his memory for 40 years is an experience which stands alone in the history of man, perhaps. Cautet identified other relics. This hat belonged to Auguste Thérèse. He carried the cage of pigeons which we proposed to set free upon the summit. Here is the wing of one of those pigeons, and here is the fragment of my broken baton. It was by grace of that baton that my life was saved. Who could have told me that I should one day have the satisfaction to look again upon this bit of wood that supported me above the grave that swallowed up my unfortunate companions? No portions of the body of Thérèse, other than a piece of the skull, had been found. A diligent search was made, but without result. However, another search was instituted a year later, and this had better success. Many fragments of clothing which had belonged to the lost guides were discovered, also part of a lantern and a green veil with bloodstains on it. But the interesting feature was this. One of the searchers came suddenly upon a sleeved arm projecting from a crevice in the ice wall, with the hand outstretched as if offering greeting. The nails of this white hand were still rosy, and the pose of the extended fingers seemed to express an eloquent welcome to the long-lost light of day. The hand and arm were alone. There was no trunk. After being removed from the ice, the flesh tints quickly faded out, and the rosy nails took on the alabaster hue of death. This was the third right hand found. Therefore, all three of the lost men were accounted for, beyond cavil or question. Dr. Hamel was the Russian gentleman of the party, which made the ascent at the time of the famous disaster. He left Chamonix as soon as he conveniently could after the descent, and as he had shown a chilly indifference about the calamity, and offered neither sympathy nor assistance to the widows and orphans, he carried with him the cordial execrations of the whole community. 4 months before the first remains were found, a Chamonix guide named Barmat, a relative of one of the lost men, was in London, and one day encountered a hale old gentleman in the British Museum, who said, "I overheard your name. Are you from Chamonix, Monsieur Barmat?" "Yes, sir." "Haven't they found the bodies of my 3 guides yet? I am Dr. Hamel." "Alas, no, monsieur." "Well, you'll find them sooner or later." Yes, it is the opinion of Dr. Forbes and Mr. Tyndall that the glacier will sooner or later restore to us the remains of the unfortunate victims. Without a doubt, and it will be a great thing for Chamonix in the matter of attracting tourists. You can get up a museum with those remains that will draw. This savage idea has not improved the odor of Dr. Hamel's name in Chamonix by any means. But after all, the man was sound on human nature. His idea was conveyed to the public officials of Chamonix, and they gravely discussed it around the official council table. They were only prevented from carrying it into execution by the determined opposition of the friends and descendants of the lost guides, who insisted on giving the remains Christian burial and succeeded in their purpose. A close watch had to be kept upon all the poor remnants and fragments to prevent embezzlement. A few accessory odds and ends were sold. Rags and scraps of the coarse clothing were parted with at the rate equal to about $20 a yard. A piece of a lantern and 1 or 2 other trifles brought nearly their weight in gold, and an Englishman offered £1 for a single breeches button. Chapter 41. The fearful disaster of 1865. One of the most memorable of all the Alpine catastrophes was that of July 1865 on the Matterhorn, already slightly referred to a few pages back. The details of it are scarcely known in America. To the vast majority of readers, they are not known at all. Mr. Whymper's account is the only authentic one. I will import the chief portion of it into this book, partly because of its intrinsic interest, and partly because it gives such a vivid idea of what the perilous pastime of Alp climbing is. This was Mr. Whymper's 9th attempt during a series of years to vanquish that steep and stubborn pillar or rock. It succeeded, the other 8 were failures. No man had ever accomplished the ascent before, though the attempts had been numerous.